You are listening to Miniature Masterpieces. Chapter 1. Jane Eyre. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. The rain was pouring down in sheets and the wind was howling outside. I, Jane Eyre, was sitting in the drawing room of Gateshead Hall, where I had lived since my parents died. My aunt, Mrs. Reed, was there too, along with her 3 children John, Eliza, and Georgiana. They were my cousins, but they didn't treat me like family. Instead, they saw me as an unwelcome burden and a poor relation. As I sat by the window, watching the rain pelt the panes, I thought about my life at Gateshead. I remembered the times when John had thrown books at me, Eliza had pulled my hair, and Georgiana had taunted me with her beauty. I thought about how they all listened eagerly to my aunt's stories about my supposed faults and misdeeds, and how they believed her every word without question. My reverie was interrupted by my aunt, who entered the room with a stern expression on her face. She told me that I was a wicked and ungrateful child, and that I should be thankful for her kindness in taking me in after my parents' death. She then informed me that I would be sent away to Lowood School, a charity institution for orphan and poor girls. I was shocked and frightened by this news, but I knew better than to argue with my aunt. I had learned long ago that I was powerless in this house, and that I could do nothing to change my situation. So I kept my thoughts to myself, and silently endured the harsh words and treatment of my aunt and cousins. As I packed my few belongings for my departure to Lowood School, I wondered what my future would hold. Would I finally find a place where I belong? Or would I be an outcast and a victim once again? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain: I was determined to make the best of whatever lay ahead. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of trepidation, I set out on the next phase of my journey, a journey that would ultimately lead me to the heights of happiness and the depths of despair, but one that I would never regret. Chapter 2. I am sent to Lowood School. The next morning, I left Gateshead Hall for Lowood School, a charity institution for orphan and poor girls. I was accompanied by a coachman who drove me in a carriage through the countryside. The journey was long and tedious, and the rain continued to fall in sheets, but I didn't mind. I was relieved to be leaving Gateshead Hall and my cruel relatives behind. After what seemed like hours, we arrived at Lowood School. The building was plain and unimpressive, but it was a welcome sight to me. I was greeted by Miss Miller, one of the teachers, who took me to the schoolroom. There, I saw a group of girls who were as plain and unimpressive as the building itself. They wore plain frocks, had simple hairstyles, and looked as if they had never known a moment of luxury in their lives. Miss Miller introduced me to the headmistress, Miss Temple, who was a kind and motherly woman. She welcomed me to Lowood School and gave me a brief tour of the premises. I saw the dormitories, the classrooms, the refectory, and the infirmary. Everything was clean and well kept, but it was clear that the school had little money to spare. As the days passed, I settled into my new life at Lowood School. I made a few friends among the girls, but I also learned that life at the school was not easy. The food was plain and unappetizing. The beds were hard and uncomfortable, and the routines were strict and unforgiving. But I was determined to make the best of my situation and to learn as much as I could. I threw myself into my studies, and soon found that I had a talent for learning. Miss Temple and the other teachers recognized my abilities and encouraged me to develop my mind. I also discovered that I had a talent for art, and began to spend my free time drawing and painting. Despite the hardships of life at Lowood School, I began to feel a sense of belonging there. I had found a place where I could learn and grow, and where I was valued for my abilities rather than scorned for my supposed faults. And as I looked out of the window at the rain falling on the moors, I knew that my journey was far from over, but I was ready to face whatever lay ahead. Chapter 3: The Gateshead Family. It had been several years since I had left Gateshead Hall for Lowood School. The memories of my time there lingered in my mind, and I often thought about my cruel relatives, my aunt, Mrs. Reed, and her children, John, Eliza, and Georgiana. One day, I received a letter from Bessie, a former servant at Gateshead Hall who had been kind to me during my time there. She informed me that my aunt was ill and wished to see me before she died. Despite the ill treatment I had received from my aunt, I felt a sense of duty and obligation to visit her in her time of need, and so I set out for Gateshead Hall, the place where I had suffered so much as a child. As I walked through the familiar rooms, I was flooded with memories of the past. I remembered the times when I had been locked in the Red Room, the times when I had been punished for things I had not done, and the times when I had been mocked and taunted by my cousins. But as I approached my aunt's sick bed, I tried to put those memories aside and to be kind and compassionate. I saw that my aunt was weak and frail, and that death was approaching her. She spoke to me in a weak voice, asking for my forgiveness and expressing regret for the way she had treated me in the past. I forgave her, knowing that it was the right thing to do. After my aunt's death, I stayed at Gateshead Hall for a few days to settle her affairs. I spoke with my cousins, who were now grown up and married, and found that they had changed little since my departure. John was still rude and domineering. Eliza was still cold and distant, and Georgiana was still vain and shallow. As I prepared to leave Gateshead Hall once again, I felt a sense of relief and closure. I knew that I had faced my past and had forgiven those who had wronged me. And as I walked out of the gates of Gateshead Hall, I knew that I was ready to face whatever the future held with courage, grace, and a heart full of hope. Chapter 4: The First Morning at Lowood. The first morning at Lowood School was an experience I would never forget. I woke up before dawn to the sound of the rising bell, which signaled the beginning of the day. I rubbed my sleepy eyes and got out of bed, feeling the cold air on my bare feet. I dressed quickly in my plain school uniform, and then followed the other girls out of the dormitory and into the schoolroom. There, we were greeted by Miss Scatcherd, one of the teachers, who began the day with a prayer and a reading from the Bible. I listened attentively, trying to absorb the words and the meaning behind them. Then we were given a breakfast of bread and milk, which was plain but nourishing. After breakfast, we began our studies. We had lessons in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and other subjects. The teachers were strict and demanding, but they were also fair and knowledgeable. I found that I enjoyed learning, and that I was good at it. I took pride in my achievements, and tried to help the other girls who were struggling. As the day wore on, I began to feel the effects of the strict routines and the plain food. My stomach growled with hunger, and my back ached from sitting in the hard chairs. But I reminded myself that I was lucky to be at Lowood School, and that I had to make the most of my opportunities. During a break in the afternoon, I went outside to get some fresh air. I walked along the gravel path that led to the garden, and saw the other girls playing and chatting in small groups. I felt a sense of camaraderie with them, and a sense of belonging to a community that was based on mutual support and respect. As the day drew to a close, I was exhausted but satisfied. I had survived my first day at Lowood School, and I had learned a great deal. I knew that there were many more days like this to come, and that I would face challenges and setbacks along the way. But I also knew that I had the strength and the determination to overcome them and to achieve my dreams. And as I fell asleep that night, I felt a sense of peace and contentment, knowing that I was on the path to a better future. Chapter 5: The School Room. The schoolroom at Lowood School was a place of learning and discipline. It was where we spent most of our days, sitting at our desks, studying our lessons, and listening to the teachers. The room was large and airy, with tall windows that let in the light and the fresh air. But it was also plain and unadorned, with little to distract us from our studies. The desks were arranged in rows, with a narrow aisle between them. We sat at our desks in silence, with our books and our pens, trying to absorb the knowledge that was being imparted to us. We were not allowed to speak or to move, except when we were called upon by the teachers. And we were expected to show respect and obedience at all times. The teachers in the schoolroom were a varied bunch. Some were kind and understanding, while others were stern and demanding. Miss Miller, who had greeted me on my first day at Lowood School, was one of the kind ones. She had a gentle manner and a soft voice, and she often took pity on those of us who were struggling. Miss Scatcherd, on the other hand, was one of the demanding ones. She had a sharp tongue and a quick temper, and she was not afraid to use them. Despite the strictness of the schoolroom, I found that I enjoyed learning. I read books on a wide range of subjects, from history and geography to literature and science. I practiced my writing and my arithmetic, trying to improve my skills. And I listened to the teachers, trying to understand the lessons they were imparting. But the schoolroom was not without its hardships. The hours were long and the routines were strict. We were expected to sit still and pay attention for hours on end, without a break. And the punishments for misbehavior were severe, ranging from a reprimand to a flogging. Despite these hardships, I found that the schoolroom was a place of refuge and opportunity. It was a place where I could escape from the harshness of the world outside, and where I could learn and grow. And as I looked around at my fellow students, I knew that I was not alone in my struggle. We were all in this together, and we would succeed or fail as a community. And as I returned to my studies, I felt a sense of pride and purpose, knowing that I was on the path to a better life. Chapter 6: The Brockslehursts and Miss Temple. The arrival of Miss Temple at Lowood School was a breath of fresh air. She was a woman of intelligence and grace, with a kind heart and a deep love for her students. She brought a new sense of hope and possibility to the school, and she quickly became a role model for me. Under Miss Temple's guidance, I began to thrive at Lowood School. I excelled in my studies, and I was soon appointed as a monitor with responsibilities for the younger girls. I took my duties seriously, and I worked hard to ensure that the younger girls were well cared for. But despite the improvements brought by Miss Temple, Lowood School was still a place of deprivation and hardship. The food was poor, the clothing was shabby, and the conditions were harsh. And the school was still subject to the harsh rule of Mr. Brocklehurst and his family. The Brocklehursts were a family of harsh and unforgiving people, with a strict adherence to the doctrines of poverty and hardship. They believed that the girls at Lowood School should be subjected to strict discipline and a life of hardship, as a means of preparing them for their future as governesses and teachers. But Miss Temple was a voice of reason and kindness in the midst of the Brocklehurst's harsh rule. She advocated for the girls, and she worked to improve the conditions at the school. She became a mother figure to many of us, and a beacon of hope in the darkness of Lowood. And as I looked to Miss Temple for guidance and inspiration, I began to dream of a life beyond the walls of Lowood School. I dreamed of a life of freedom and adventure, of a life filled with love and possibility. And I knew that I had the strength and the courage to pursue my dreams, thanks to the guidance and inspiration of Miss Temple. Chapter 7. The Girl's Hair. At Lowood School, the girl's hair was an important part of our appearance. It was a reflection of our cleanliness and orderliness, and it was subject to the strict rules and regulations of the institution. The hair of the younger girls was cut short, while the hair of the older girls was worn in a long plait down the back. The plait had to be tightly braided, with no loose hairs, and it had to be brushed and washed every day. The rules surrounding our hair were strict, but they were also a source of pride and discipline. We took great care in our appearance, and we took great pride in following the rules of the institution. But for me, the rules surrounding hair were also a source of frustration and resentment. I longed to be free from the strictures of the institution, and I longed to express myself in ways that went beyond the confines of the school. One day, I had the opportunity to express myself in a small way. I was allowed to go to the village to have my hair cut, and I asked the barber to give me a short, modern haircut. The haircut was a small act of rebellion, but it was also a symbol of my desire for freedom and individuality. When I returned to the school, I was met with disapproval and scorn. The teachers and the other students viewed my haircut as a sign of disrespect and disobedience. But for me, it was a small victory, a sign that I was not willing to conform to the expectations of others. And as I went to bed that night, I felt a sense of pride and defiance. I knew that I had taken a small step towards the life that I wanted, a life of freedom and individuality. And I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was ready to face it with courage and with the knowledge that I was my own person, with my own dreams and aspirations. Chapter 8. The Death of Mr. Brocklehurst. The death of Mr. Brocklehurst was a turning point in my time at Lowood School. His passing marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new phase in the life of the institution. Mr. Brocklehurst had been a harsh and unforgiving figure, with little regard for the well-being of the students at the school. He had subjected us to strict discipline and a life of hardship, with little hope for a better future. But with his passing, a new sense of hope and possibility emerged at Lowood School. The new management of the school was more compassionate and forward-thinking, and they were committed to improving the conditions at the institution. Under the new management, the food improved, the clothing became more comfortable, and the living conditions were less harsh. The new management also placed a greater emphasis on education, and the students were given more opportunities to learn and to develop their skills. For me, the death of Mr. Brocklehurst was a personal victory. It marked the end of a time of hardship and deprivation, and the beginning of a new phase in my life. It was a sign that I could pursue my dreams and ambitions, and that I could make a life for myself beyond the walls of the school. But it was also a reminder of the fragility of life, and of the importance of living every day to the fullest. It was a reminder that our time on this earth is limited, and that we must make the most of the opportunities that we are given. And as I looked to the future with hope and optimism, I knew that I would always carry the lessons of my time at Lowood School with me. The lessons of resilience, of perseverance, and of the importance of pursuing our dreams, no matter the obstacles that we may face. Chapter 9: The Red Room. The Red Room was a place of darkness and mystery, a place that held a great power over me. It was a room that I had been forbidden to enter, a room that held the secrets of my family's past. As a child, I had been filled with curiosity and a burning desire to uncover the secrets of the Red Room. But as I stood outside its door, I was filled with a sense of foreboding, a sense that I was about to enter a world of danger and darkness. But I was also determined to uncover the truth, to uncover the secrets that had been hidden from me for so long. And so, with a sense of trepidation and fear, I entered the Red Room. Inside, the room was dark and foreboding, with shadows cast by the flickering candlelight. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and the weight of the past. And in the center of the room stood a large, four-poster bed, covered in dark red curtains. As I stood in the center of the room, I felt a sense of dread and a growing sense of panic. The room seemed to be closing in on me, and I felt as though I was being suffocated by the weight of the past. But I refused to give in to my fear. I refused to be held captive by the secrets of the Red Room. And with a fierce determination, I broke free from the hold that the room had over me, and I emerged into the light, with a sense of freedom and liberation. The Red Room had held me captive for too long, and now I was free to pursue my own path, to uncover the truth, and to make my own destiny. And as I emerged from the darkness of the Red Room, I knew that I had the strength and the courage to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 10: The Evening at Mr. Rochester's. The evening at Thornfield Hall, Mr. Rochester's home, was a turning point in my life. It was a night that changed my perception of the world and of myself. As I entered the grand hall of Thornfield, I felt a sense of wonder and curiosity. The house was alive with flickering candles, and the air was filled with the scent of roses and lavender. As I made my way through the elegant rooms, I was introduced to Mr. Rochester, the owner of the estate. He was a man of great charisma, with a rugged charm that set him apart from anyone I had ever met. He was witty and sharp, and his conversation held me spellbound. During dinner, I was struck by the contrast between Mr. Rochester's world and my own humble existence. The food was abundant and exotic, and the wine flowed freely. The guests were sophisticated and worldly, and their conversation was filled with wit and humor. As the evening wore on, Mr. Rochester began to reveal more of himself to me. He was a man of contradictions, with a fierce temper and a vulnerable side. He confided in me about his past, and his hopes and dreams for the future. As the night drew to a close, I felt a sense of loss at the thought of leaving Thornfield Hall. I had discovered a new world, a world of possibilities and adventure, and I knew that I would never be the same again. Mr. Rochester had awakened something in me, a spirit of adventure and independence, and I knew that my life would never be the same again. The evening at Mr. Rochester's was a moment of awakening for me, a moment when I realized that the world was full of wonder and mystery, and that my destiny was my own to make. Chapter 11: Mr. Rochester. The unexpected arrival of Mr. Rochester, a wealthy and handsome gentleman, had taken Thornfield by storm. His peculiar habits, quick temper, and biting wit made him a fascinating figure in Jane's eyes. She found herself both drawn to and intimidated by his presence. As the days passed, Mr. Rochester and Jane began to engage in lively conversations, which sparked a deep intellectual and emotional connection between them. Despite their differences in social standing and age, they were able to find common ground and develop a mutual respect for each other. However, as Jane's feelings for Mr. Rochester began to grow, she became increasingly aware of the barriers that separated them. His impending marriage to the beautiful and haughty Blanche Ingram, as well as their differences in age and social status, made it clear that any romantic relationship between them was impossible. Despite this realization, Jane could not help but be drawn to Mr. Rochester's enigmatic personality and charming mannerisms. She found herself wondering about his past and the secrets that he seemed to be hiding behind his brooding exterior. As Jane struggled with her growing feelings for Mr. Rochester, she also began to experience strange occurrences in the house. Unexplained laughter, eerie voices, and bizarre happenings in the dead of night left her feeling unsettled and afraid. Amidst all of this, Jane found herself more and more drawn to Mr. Rochester, and she could not help but feel that fate had brought them together for a reason. As she continued to grapple with her feelings and the mysterious happenings in the house, she could only hope that a way forward would reveal itself in time. Chapter 12. The Secrets of Thornfield. The secrets of Thornfield continue to unfold in Chapter 12, as Jane begins to piece together the mysteries of Mr. Rochester's past. One evening, while walking in the gardens, she hears an eerie laugh coming from the third-story attic. When she questions Mrs. Fairfax, she is met with evasive responses, fueling her curiosity even more. Jane's curiosity about Mr. Rochester's past begins to consume her, and she starts to notice strange occurrences around the house. She overhears Mr. Rochester on the phone, discussing an impending marriage, which he is clearly not looking forward to. She also catches glimpses of a woman in the attic, but is unable to get a clear view. As Jane's suspicions grow, she confronts Mr. Rochester, demanding to know the truth about the strange happenings at Thornfield. Mr. Rochester eventually reveals his dark secret. The woman in the attic is his wife, whom he had married while he was still a young man. She is mentally unstable, and her care is the reason why Mr. Rochester had been traveling so much. Jane is shocked and heartbroken by the revelation. She feels betrayed by Mr. Rochester, and the thought of his wife, who is hidden away from the world, breaks her heart. Mr. Rochester begs Jane not to leave him, professing his love for her. However, Jane realizes that she cannot stay with Mr. Rochester, who is still technically married, and that she must leave Thornfield. Charlotte Bronte's masterful writing style captures the suspense and drama of Chapter 12, as the secrets of Thornfield are slowly revealed. She expertly weaves together the intricate plot details, building tension and suspense until the dramatic climax, which leaves the reader eagerly anticipating the next chapter. The vivid descriptions of Thornfield, its inhabitants, and the dark secrets that lurk within its walls transport the reader into the world of Jane Eyre, leaving a lasting impression on the imagination. Chapter 13. Thornfield. Thornfield, a sprawling estate located deep in the heart of the English countryside, was a place of great mystery and intrigue for Jane Eyre. Having arrived there to take up her position as governess to Mr. Rochester's ward, Adele Varennes, Jane found herself drawn into a world of secrets and shadows, where every whisper seemed to hold some deeper meaning. Despite her initial apprehension, however, Jane found herself growing increasingly fond of Thornfield and its inhabitants. She soon became friends with Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, who welcomed her warmly and helped her to settle in. She also developed a close bond with Adele, who was a vivacious and charming child. But it was Mr. Rochester who held the greatest fascination for Jane. He was a complex and enigmatic figure, with a rough exterior that belied a deeply sensitive and passionate nature. Jane found herself drawn to him in spite of herself, and soon came to realize that she was in love with him. As she explored Thornfield and its environs, Jane began to uncover the secrets that lay hidden beneath the surface of the estate. She discovered the existence of a strange, dark attic, which was kept locked and forbidden to all. And she began to suspect that there was something strange and unsettling about the noises she heard in the night, and the shadowy figure that seemed to haunt the corridors. Despite her growing unease, however, Jane remained determined to unravel the mysteries of Thornfield and to discover the truth about Mr. Rochester. And as she delved deeper into the secrets of the estate, she found herself drawn ever closer to the man she had come to love, with its atmosphere of brooding suspense and its complex, nuanced characters. The world of Thornfield was a place of great fascination for Jane Eyre. And as she began to unravel its secrets, she found herself drawn ever deeper into its web of mystery and intrigue, with no way of knowing what lay ahead. Chapter 14. My First Success. It was with great excitement that Jane started her new role as a teacher at Lowood School. She felt like she had found a true calling in life and was eager to prove herself. With Miss Temple as her guide, she quickly settled into the routine and found herself gaining confidence in her abilities. Jane was not the only one to take notice of her success. One day, a gentleman named Mr. St. John Rivers visited the school and expressed his admiration for her work. He was impressed with her teaching skills and offered her a position as a governess to his two sisters. Although she was initially hesitant, Jane eventually accepted the offer and moved to a new town to start her new job. As she settled into her new role, Jane found that her life had become more comfortable than it had ever been before. She enjoyed the company of her pupils and found that the Rivers household was a pleasant place to live. However, she couldn't help but feel that something was missing in her life. She longed for the passion and excitement she had experienced with Mr. Rochester, and she couldn't forget him no matter how hard she tried. Despite her reservations, Jane found herself drawn to Mr. Rivers. He was kind and intelligent, and she found herself feeling a deep admiration for him. However, she couldn't shake the feeling that her heart belonged to another. In the end, Jane made the difficult decision to turn down Mr. Rivers' marriage proposal. She knew that her heart belonged to Mr. Rochester, and she couldn't bear the thought of living a life without true love. With a heavy heart, she left the Rivers household and set out on a journey to find Mr. Rochester and discover her true fate. As Jane set out on her journey, she knew that she was taking a risk. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she had to follow her heart. With each step she took, she felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. She knew that she was destined for great things, and she was eager to discover what the future had in store for her. Chapter 15. We knew Servitude. It had been a year since Jane arrived at Thornfield Hall, and her life had taken a drastic turn. She was now the governess of Adele, a young French girl who was Mr. Rochester's ward. Jane had become accustomed to her new life, and her feelings for Mr. Rochester had grown stronger each day. However, she knew that as a governess, she was beneath his social status and could never be his equal. One day, While taking a walk, Jane encountered a stranger who warned her about the dangers of trusting Mr. Rochester. This encounter left her confused and worried about what he might be hiding. Her doubts were only strengthened when Mr. Rochester returned from a trip with a group of guests, including the beautiful Blanche Ingram. He seemed to be paying particular attention to Blanche, which left Jane feeling jealous and hurt. As the days went by, Jane became more aware of the differences between her and the wealthy guests at Thornfield. She felt like an outsider, and her feelings for Mr. Rochester only added to her pain. To make matters worse, Mr. Rochester's flirtation with Blanche continued, and it was apparent that she was the woman he was expected to marry. Jane's heart was broken, and she knew that she needed to make a change in her life. She decided to take a job as a governess elsewhere, and after giving her notice to Mr. Rochester, she began to make preparations to leave. However, fate had other plans for Jane. On the night before she was due to depart, a strange event occurred at Thornfield. A fire broke out in Mr. Rochester's room, and Jane was the one who discovered it. She immediately alerted the household, and with her quick thinking and bravery, she helped to put out the fire and save Mr. Rochester's life. In the aftermath of the fire, Mr. Rochester finally revealed his true feelings for Jane, confessing that he loved her and that he could not marry Blanche Ingram. He proposed to Jane, and she accepted, finally finding the happiness she had been seeking. Despite her earlier doubts and fears, Jane realized that Mr. Rochester was the man she truly loved, and the one who loved her in return. The new servitude that she had once dreaded had ultimately led her to her true love, and she was grateful for all that had happened to bring her to this point in her life. Chapter 16. The Visit to the Attic. As Jane settled into her new life at Thornfield, her curiosity about the mysterious attic continued to grow. She had heard strange noises coming from the area, and despite her initial fear, her curiosity eventually got the better of her. One day, while exploring the upper floors of the house, she finally found the key to the attic door. As she climbed the stairs to the attic, Jane couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The space was dark and musty, and she could hear the scurrying of rats in the distance. However, her curiosity pushed her forward, and she soon discovered the source of the strange noises: a woman, locked away in a small room. The woman was clearly disturbed, and Jane was both frightened and moved by her plight. She learned that the woman was Bertha Mason, the wife of Mr. Rochester. Bertha was kept locked away in the attic due to her mental illness, and Jane was shocked to learn that Mr. Rochester had been keeping the secret from her. Jane struggled with her feelings for Mr. Rochester in light of this discovery. She had already developed strong feelings for him, and she was now confronted with the reality that he had been hiding a major part of his life from her. Jane knew that their relationship could never be the same, and she felt that she could never truly trust him again. As she left the attic, Jane felt a mix of emotions: fear, confusion, and sadness. She knew that she could never forget what she had seen, but she also knew that she had to keep the secret to protect Mr. Rochester's reputation. Despite her inner turmoil, she remained determined to do what was right, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. Chapter 17. Rochester at Last. Jane had spent months away from Thornfield Hall, with no news of Mr. Rochester. Despite her new life with St. John Rivers and her growing affection for him, her thoughts kept returning to the master of Thornfield. She knew that she loved him, and the thought of him being lost to her forever was almost unbearable. One day, she received a letter from a strange man, informing her that he had heard of her desire to find work as a governess and had a position for her at a nearby house. Jane realized that the letter was from Mr. Rochester, who had disguised himself and was trying to find out if she still cared for him. She accepted the position, and as she traveled to the house, she felt her heart beating with anticipation and fear. Finally, she arrived at the house and saw Mr. Rochester, who was still disguised. She tried to hide her emotions, but he knew her too well and saw through her facade. They talked and laughed together, and he revealed himself to her. Jane was overjoyed, but she also felt guilty for not telling him about her engagement to St. John Rivers. Mr. Rochester told her his story, that he had married Bertha Mason, a woman he thought was of sound mind, but who turned out to be mad. She had burned down the house and killed herself in the process. Mr. Rochester had been injured trying to save her, and had been blinded in one eye and lost one hand. He had been living in a small house on the grounds of Thornfield Hall, attended by only a few loyal servants. He was a changed man, but still loved Jane deeply. Jane felt torn between her love for Mr. Rochester and her duty to St. John Rivers. But in the end, she chose love and agreed to marry Mr. Rochester, despite his injuries and diminished circumstances. They were married in a simple ceremony, and Jane felt at peace at last. Chapter 18: Marriage Plans. As I spent more time at Thornfield Hall, I began to understand that Mr. Rochester was a complex and enigmatic man. Though he was often abrupt and gruff, I found myself drawn to him and his captivating presence. One day, while walking together in the gardens, Mr. Rochester revealed to me his intention to marry. At first, I was happy for him and assumed that he was speaking of a union with Blanche Ingram, a woman he had shown interest in. However, my heart sank when he informed me that he had only been pretending to court Miss Ingram in order to make me jealous. I was torn between my love for Mr. Rochester and my sense of duty, as I knew that our relationship could never be. Nevertheless, I found myself wishing that he would propose to me, and my heart leapt when he did. But my joy was short-lived as I soon learned of an impediment to our union. Mr. Rochester was already married. Shocked and heartbroken, I could not bring myself to accept his proposal, and I left Thornfield to escape the pain of our separation. Despite my efforts to move on, I could not forget Mr. Rochester and the love I felt for him. Months passed, and I was surprised to receive a letter from him, begging me to return to him. Despite my reservations, I journeyed back to Thornfield, where I discovered the devastating truth about Mr. Rochester's secret wife, Bertha. My heart ached for Mr. Rochester and the tragedy he had endured, but I could not ignore the wrongness of his situation. I left him once again, heartbroken and uncertain of what the future would hold. As I reflected on my experiences with Mr. Rochester, I realized that my love for him had only grown stronger despite the obstacles that stood in our way. Though I was unsure of what the future held, I knew that my heart belonged to him and that I would always love him. Chapter 19: The Wedding. The day of my wedding to Mr. Rochester arrived, and I felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. I had never imagined myself marrying a man like him, and yet, here I was, about to become his wife. The ceremony was to take place in the drawing room at Thornfield, with only a few witnesses in attendance. As I waited for the ceremony to begin, I looked around the room, taking in the flowers and decorations that had been arranged for the occasion. It was all so different from the plain, unadorned Lowood School where I had spent so many years. When Mr. Rochester entered the room, my heart leaped in my chest. He looked dashing in his wedding attire, and as he took my hand, I felt a surge of emotion that was almost overwhelming. The ceremony was short but solemn, and as we exchanged our vows, I could feel the weight of my commitment to this man. I was his, and he was mine, and there was no turning back. After the ceremony, we signed the marriage register, and then we sat down to sign the marriage settlements. As we went through the legal documents, I couldn't help but feel a sense of detachment from the whole process. This was not the romantic wedding I had always dreamed of, but a legal transaction between two people. As the day wore on, we sat down to the wedding breakfast, and I finally had a chance to take in the beauty of the surroundings. The room was filled with flowers, and the table was laden with delicious food. I felt a sense of happiness wash over me, and I knew that I had made the right decision in marrying Mr. Rochester. As we sat there, enjoying our meal, Mr. Rochester leaned over and whispered in my ear. "My little wife," he said, "you look happier than you have ever done in your life. You will not be taken from me now, will you?" "No, sir," I replied, smiling at him. "We are married now, and nothing can ever come between us." And with those words, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I was Mrs. Rochester, and I knew that I was finally home. Chapter 20. The Honeymoon. As Jane and Mr. Rochester begin their honeymoon, the excitement of their union is palpable. Jane is filled with joy at the thought of spending the rest of her life with the man she loves. The couple travels to a picturesque spot in the south of France, where they spend their days exploring the stunning countryside and enjoying each other's company. The idyllic setting of their honeymoon allows Jane to appreciate the natural beauty of the world around her, which she had never experienced before. She revels in the colors of the sunset, the fragrant scent of flowers, and the soothing sound of waves crashing on the shore. The beauty of the landscape reflects the beauty of their relationship, and Jane is content. However, as time passes, a sense of unease begins to creep into Jane's mind. She starts to sense that something is amiss with her husband, but she cannot quite put her finger on it. Rochester's behavior becomes erratic and unpredictable, and Jane starts to question whether she truly knows him. As the days pass, Jane becomes increasingly anxious, and she is haunted by a sense of impending doom. She is tormented by her suspicions that Rochester may be hiding something from her, and her once idyllic honeymoon turns into a nightmare. Despite her anxieties, Jane is determined to remain faithful to Rochester and to trust him. But as the days wear on, she becomes increasingly desperate for answers. She begins to suspect that the secrets of his past are about to catch up with him, and that their future together may be in jeopardy. As the final days of their honeymoon approach, Jane's fears are finally realized. She uncovers a shocking revelation about Rochester's past, and her entire world is turned upside down. The honeymoon, once a time of joy and excitement, ends in heartbreak and despair. Despite the pain of her discovery, Jane's love for Rochester remains strong. She is determined to stay by his side and help him face the challenges that lie ahead, no matter the cost. For Jane, their love is worth fighting for, and she is willing to face any obstacle to keep it alive. Chapter 21. The Mysterious Disappearance. After the wedding, Jane and Mr. Rochester depart for their honeymoon in Europe. They spend a few weeks in Paris and then travel to Italy. They visit several picturesque towns and enjoy each other's company. But as they begin their journey to Florence, strange things start to happen. One evening, while they are walking along a deserted path, Mr. Rochester suddenly disappears. Jane frantically searches for him, but he is nowhere to be found. She calls out his name repeatedly, but there is no answer. As she continues to search, she realizes that she is lost in the unfamiliar landscape. She stumbles and falls, injuring herself in the process. As she lies there, injured and alone, Jane is filled with despair. She wonders if she will ever see Mr. Rochester again. She is plagued with thoughts of his safety and well-being. She spends the night in the open, unable to find her way back to their lodgings. The next morning, Jane is discovered by a group of local peasants who take her in and care for her. They ask her about her husband's whereabouts, but she is unable to provide any information. She is devastated and haunted by the uncertainty of his fate. Days pass, but there is no news of Mr. Rochester. Jane spends her time in anxious anticipation, hoping and praying for his safe return. She is surrounded by strangers, but she feels utterly alone. Finally, one day, Mr. Rochester reappears. He is disheveled and incoherent, having been robbed and left for dead by bandits. Jane is overjoyed at his return and nurses him back to health. They spend several more weeks in Italy before returning to England. The mysterious disappearance and subsequent reunion leave Jane shaken but grateful for the return of her beloved husband. The experience has brought them closer together, and they return home with a renewed appreciation for their love and their life together. Chapter 22. Jane's Return. After spending 8 months away from Thornfield, Jane finally returns to her former home. She's filled with mixed emotions, apprehensive about what she might find, but eager to reunite with her friends. As Jane's carriage pulls up to the house, she's surprised by the changes that have occurred during her absence. Thornfield has undergone some significant renovations, and the once weather-worn building now stands tall and stately. Inside the house, Jane is greeted warmly by Mrs. Fairfax, who's overjoyed to see her. The two women share a heartfelt conversation, and Jane learns that Mr. Rochester has returned as well. The prospect of seeing Mr. Rochester again both thrills and terrifies Jane. She knows that seeing him again will stir up old feelings that she's tried to suppress over the past few months. At the same time, she can't wait to see the man she loves again. When Jane finally meets Mr. Rochester, it's clear that he's still recovering from the tragic events that occurred in their past. He's lost a hand and his sight, and Jane feels a pang of guilt for leaving him when he needed her most. Despite the changes in his appearance, Jane can still see the man she fell in love with. His voice, his wit, and his charm remain intact, and she's soon swept up in conversation with him as if no time has passed at all. As the days go by, Jane's relationship with Mr. Rochester deepens. She becomes his constant companion, helping him adjust to his new circumstances and describing the world around him with vivid detail. Jane is torn between her love for Mr. Rochester and her sense of duty to him. She's determined to remain by his side, even as she struggles with the reality of his condition. Chapter 23. A Reunion and a Discovery. The events of the past few days had left Jane in a state of agitation and uncertainty, but her reunion with Mr. Rochester brought a sense of relief and joy to her troubled heart. As they sat together in the drawing room of Ferndale, he recounted the story of his mysterious disappearance and how he was now blind and crippled. Jane was shocked by the extent of his injuries and saddened by the thought of what he had suffered. Mr. Rochester's deep affection for Jane was evident in his every word and gesture, and she was moved by his declaration of love. Despite his physical condition, he implored Jane to become his wife and live with him at Ferndean. Jane, however, remained resolute in her decision to leave Mr. Rochester and make a life for herself elsewhere. She could not forget the past, and the memory of the woman in the attic haunted her still. In the midst of their conversation, a visitor arrived, St. John Rivers. The surprise of his appearance was not unwelcome, and the three sat down to talk. During their discussion, St. John revealed that he had discovered Jane's true identity and informed her of her uncle's death and the inheritance that was now rightfully hers. This news was both shocking and liberating to Jane, who had longed for a sense of belonging and security. The discovery of her inheritance brought a newfound confidence to Jane, and she felt ready to embrace her future. As she contemplated her next steps, Mr. Rochester remained in her thoughts, and the knowledge of his love for her weighed heavily on her heart. However, she remained steadfast in her decision to live a life of independence and self-reliance. The reunion with Mr. Rochester had brought a sense of closure and peace to Jane, and the discovery of her inheritance had opened up new possibilities for her. As she left Ferndean, she felt a sense of freedom and hope for the future. She knew that her path would be challenging, but she was determined to forge ahead and create a life that was true to her own desires and aspirations. Chapter 24. Helen Burns. The visit to Lowood was a revelation for Jane. The place where she had spent 8 years of her life had been transformed. The new superintendent, Mr. Brocklehurst, had made several changes to improve the school, and the students were better cared for and educated than when Jane was a student there. Jane was particularly pleased to see her old friend, Miss Temple, who was still at the school as a teacher. Miss Temple was happy to see Jane and welcomed her warmly. They talked about old times, and Jane asked about Helen Burns, her dear friend who had passed away from consumption. Miss Temple told Jane that Helen had been a model student and was much loved by all who knew her. She had a gentle and kind heart, and had a profound influence on everyone around her. Jane was moved to tears as she listened to Miss Temple speak about Helen. She remembered her friend's quiet strength and unwavering faith, which had sustained her through her illness. Jane was also glad to see that her legacy still lived on at the school. Several of the students had been inspired by her example and had become teachers themselves. They were continuing the work that Miss Temple and Helen Burns had started, passing on their knowledge and values to the next generation. As Jane toured the school, she saw how much had changed since she had been a student there. The building had been renovated and expanded, and the students now had access to better facilities and resources. Jane was glad to see that Mr. Brocklehurst had kept his promise to improve the school. As she left Lowood, Jane felt a sense of gratitude for the time she had spent there. Despite the hardships she had endured, she had received a valuable education that had helped her to become the woman she was today. And she was proud to know that her old school was still fulfilling its mission to provide a good education for young women. As she walked away from the school, Jane felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was determined to use her own education and experience to make a difference in the world, just as Helen Burns had done in her own quiet way. She knew that her friend's memory would always be with her, guiding her on her own journey of self-discovery and service to others. Chapter 25. The New Pupil. My new position as a teacher at Lowood brought new responsibilities and a sense of purpose to my life. I felt proud of my ability to impart knowledge to the girls and to be a positive influence in their lives. One day, as I was walking with Miss Temple, she confided in me about a new pupil, who she believed was destined for great things. This pupil, Miss Temple explained, was the daughter of a wealthy family and had been sent to Lowood to receive a first-class education. Her name was Rosamond Oliver, and her beauty and grace made her the envy of all the girls. I was eager to meet this new pupil and see for myself the qualities that had so impressed Miss Temple. When Rosamond arrived at Lowood, I was struck by her elegance and poise. She was not only beautiful, but also intelligent and accomplished, with a talent for music and a gift for languages. As I got to know her better, I began to understand why Miss Temple had such high hopes for her future. However, despite her many talents, Rosamond was not immune to the struggles that all young women faced in those times. She confided in me about her love for a man who was not considered suitable by her family. As we talked, I couldn't help but think of Mr. Rochester and how our love had been thwarted by society's expectations. Rosamond's situation made me realize that, despite our different backgrounds, we were not so different after all. We were both women who wanted to be able to make our own choices in life, and not be bound by the restrictions imposed upon us by society. As the weeks went by, I grew increasingly fond of Rosamond, and we spent many happy hours together. However, our time together was not to last, as Rosamond's family came to take her away from Lowood. Although I was saddened by her departure, I felt grateful for the brief but meaningful friendship we had shared. The memory of Rosamond stayed with me for a long time after she left, and I often wondered what had become of her. I could only hope that she had found happiness and fulfillment in her life, just as I had in mine. Chapter 26. A Month of Separation. The month-long separation from Mr. Rochester had been a difficult time for Jane, but it was also a time of self-reflection and growth. She had been offered a new job as a teacher at a school in Morden, and while she missed Rochester terribly, she found that the routine of her new life was a welcome distraction. During her time at Morden, Jane proved to be an excellent teacher and gained the respect and admiration of both her colleagues and students. She enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of teaching and found it to be a fulfilling career. However, despite the distraction, Jane's thought often drifted back to Mr. Rochester and their time together. One day, as she was walking alone, Jane saw a vision of Mr. Rochester. It was so vivid that she could almost believe he was really there. Overcome with emotion, she collapsed on the ground and wept. When she regained her composure, she realized that her vision was a result of her own intense feelings and that she needed to move on. But just when Jane had resigned herself to a life without Mr. Rochester, fate intervened. One day, while on a walk, Jane encountered a familiar figure. It was Mr. Rochester, and he had been searching for her. He explained that he had been injured in a fire that destroyed Thornfield, but that he had managed to survive. Despite being blinded and disfigured, he professed his love for Jane and asked her to marry him. Jane was torn between her love for Mr. Rochester and her sense of morality. She knew that his situation was difficult, but she also believed that it was not right for her to marry him while he was still legally married to Bertha Mason. Despite her conflicting emotions, Jane realized that she could not live without Mr. Rochester and agreed to marry him. The month of separation had been a time of growth for Jane, but it had also taught her the value of true love and the importance of following her heart. She had come to understand that life was unpredictable and that it was impossible to plan for every eventuality. By embracing the uncertainties of life and the unpredictable nature of love, Jane had found happiness and fulfillment. Chapter 27. Mr. Rochester's Adieu. My hopes and dreams of a happy life with Mr. Rochester had been crushed, and my heart felt heavy as I watched him depart from Thornfield. Although it was the right decision, it was still difficult to let go of the love we had shared. Days went by, and I found solace in the company of Diana and Mary Rivers, who had come to visit me. They were a comfort to me, and we spent many hours conversing and reading together. I also busied myself with teaching at a local school, which kept my mind occupied. One evening, as I was returning from the school, I was surprised to see Mr. Rochester waiting for me at the gate. He had been badly injured in the fire that destroyed Thornfield, and had lost his sight and one of his hands. I was overcome with emotion at the sight of him, and we fell into each other's arms. Grateful for our reunion, we spent many happy months together, Mr. Rochester and I became his eyes and his hands, caring for him in every way possible. Though his appearance had changed, his spirit was still the same, and he remained the man I had fallen in love with. As the months passed, Mr. Rochester's health began to fail, and he grew increasingly frail. It was clear that his time on earth was coming to an end. On his deathbed, he asked for my forgiveness for the way he had treated me in the past, and I gave it willingly, grateful for the love we had shared. After his passing, I inherited his fortune, and I used it to help others in need, following his wishes. I also discovered that I had family in the form of my cousins, the Rivers, and I went to live with them. Although I would never forget Mr. Rochester, I knew that my future lay with my newfound family, and I was content to start a new life with them. Looking back on my time with Mr. Rochester, I realized that everything that happened had been for a reason. The trials and tribulations we had faced had led us to each other, and I was grateful for every moment we had shared. I knew that he would always hold a special place in my heart, and that our love would live on, even after his passing. Chapter 28. The Parlour and the Garden. It had been a month since Jane's return to Thornfield, and life had settled into a peaceful routine. She spent her days teaching Adele and working on her own studies while Mr. Rochester was away attending to business matters. The evenings were spent in the company of Mrs. Fairfax, who was a kind and gentle companion. One afternoon, while walking in the garden, Jane heard Mr. Rochester's voice calling her name. She followed the sound and found him seated under a tree. As they talked, Jane noticed that Mr. Rochester seemed troubled and preoccupied. After a moment of hesitation, Mr. Rochester confessed his love for Jane and begged her to become his wife. Jane was taken aback by this sudden declaration and struggled to contain her emotions. She asked Mr. Rochester if he was certain of his feelings and if it was proper for them to marry, given their difference in social status and the fact that he was still technically married. Mr. Rochester reassured Jane of his love and insisted that his wife was insane and locked away in a distant corner of his estate, so they need not worry about her. He also revealed that he had plans to take Adele with him to live in the south of France, leaving them free to be together without any social repercussions. Despite her love for Mr. Rochester, Jane knew that it was not right to be with him while he was still married. She told him that she could not be with him in such a way and that she would have to leave Thornfield. Mr. Rochester, devastated by her response, begged her to stay, and promised to make things right. As Jane left the garden, she was torn between her love for Mr. Rochester and her sense of propriety. She knew that her decision to leave would break both of their hearts, but she could not bring herself to compromise her principles. The days that followed were filled with tension and heartache as both Jane and Mr. Rochester struggled with their feelings and the difficult choices that lay ahead. In the end, Jane's decision to leave Thornfield would prove to be a turning point in her life. It was a moment of great courage and self-sacrifice that would set her on a path towards true independence and self-realization. But it was also a moment of great pain and sorrow, as she was forced to give up the man she loved and the life she had hoped to build with him. Chapter 29. The Maniac. The next morning, I rose early and went to visit Mr. Rochester. I found him alone in his library, looking pale and worn. He told me that the previous night he had been awakened by a strange noise and had found his bed curtains on fire. He had managed to put out the flames, but the incident had left him shaken. As we talked, we heard a loud shriek from the garden. Rushing outside, we found that it was Bertha, who had broken out of her room and was now running wild through the grounds. Rochester was able to subdue her, but not before she had bitten and injured Mason. I was horrified by the scene, and it was clear to me that Bertha was truly a maniac, dangerous and uncontrollable. Rochester explained that he had kept her locked up for years, but that she had managed to escape her confinement that night. The situation was grave, and Rochester knew that he could no longer keep Bertha hidden away. He shared with me his plans to send her to an asylum in London, where she could receive the care and treatment she needed. He also revealed the truth about his past and the circumstances that had led to his marriage to Bertha. I listened with sympathy as Rochester poured out his heart to me, and I could see the pain and regret in his eyes. I knew that I still loved him, despite everything, and that nothing could change the depth of my feelings. As the day wore on, Rochester became increasingly agitated, and I could see that the events of the previous night had taken a toll on him. I stayed with him as long as I could, but eventually had to return to my own quarters. As I lay in bed that night, I thought of Rochester and the difficult path he was now forced to take. I prayed for him, and for Bertha, and for all those whose lives had been touched by this tragedy. And I wondered what the future would hold for me and for the men I love. Chapter 30. The Fire. It was a cold, wintry night when the flames burst forth at Thornfield Hall. I woke up to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames. In a moment, I realized the danger that we were in. The fire had started in the third floor of the house, and it was quickly spreading. I ran out of my room, dressed only in my nightgown, and saw that Mr. Rochester was already awake and alerting the other inhabitants of the house. We hurriedly tried to put out the fire, but it was too late. The flames were consuming everything in their path, and we had to evacuate the house. The panic and chaos that followed were overwhelming. The servants were rushing about, trying to save as much as they could, while Mr. Rochester was desperately trying to find his wife, who he believed to be lost in the inferno. In the midst of the confusion, I too became separated from Mr. Rochester, and found myself wandering outside the house in the bitter cold. I felt helpless and alone, watching as the only home I had ever known was destroyed. Eventually, the fire was put out, and we took stock of the damage. The entire third floor of the house was destroyed, and the rest of the house was badly damaged by smoke and water. The once magnificent Thornfield Hall was now reduced to ruins. As we were all gathered outside, shivering and exhausted, Mr. Rochester made a shocking announcement. His wife, Bertha Mason, had been the cause of the fire. She had set fire to the curtains in her room and had perished in the flames. The news was a devastating blow, and we all mourned for what had been lost. Thornfield Hall would never be the same again. But in the midst of the tragedy, Mr. Rochester and I found solace in each other's company, and I began to see a glimmer of hope for our future together. Chapter 31. The Recuperation. After the traumatic event of the fire, I found myself in a state of confusion, unable to understand the twists and turns that fate had brought to my life. Yet, the sense of being alive gave me hope and comforted me in some way. I felt a deep sense of gratitude towards those who saved me, especially St. John, who had not only helped me survive but also welcomed me into his home. The following weeks were spent in recuperation, during which I regained my strength and began to appreciate the beauty of the surrounding nature. St. John proved to be a kind and attentive nurse, always checking on me and providing me with everything I needed. However, despite his caring ways, I couldn't help but feel that he was hiding something from me, something important that concerned my future. During my stay with St. John, I received a letter from an unexpected source, Mr. Rochester. The letter informed me of his whereabouts and his current situation, which only deepened my longing to see him again. Although St. John urged me to forget about him, I couldn't bring myself to do so, for my heart still yearned for him. As I began to regain my strength, I also became more aware of St. John's intentions towards me. He saw me as a potential partner in his missionary work in India, and he believed that our marriage would be a perfect match. Although I admired his dedication and commitment to his cause, I knew that my heart belonged to another. Despite my reservations, I found myself contemplating his proposal, for it seemed like a chance to start anew and leave my past behind. However, something within me still resisted, a feeling that urged me to follow my heart and not settle for anything less than true love. In the end, I realized that my heart would never be content with anything less than the love of my life, Mr. Rochester. Thus, I refused St. John's proposal, knowing that my decision would lead me on a path filled with uncertainty and challenges, but also hope and joy. As I left St. John's home and made my way towards Thornfield, I couldn't help but wonder what fate had in store for me. However, one thing was clear: my heart was set on reuniting with Mr. Rochester, no matter the cost. Chapter 32. The Second Marriage. As the days passed, my love for Mr. Rochester deepened and I began to see his goodness shining through. He was a changed man, no longer brooding and melancholic, but rather content and at peace. We spent many happy hours together, discussing our plans for the future and reminiscing about the past. Yet, as much as we loved each other, the fact remained that our union could never be blessed by the church. One day, Mr. Rochester approached me with a proposal. He suggested that we live together as husband and wife, without the formalities of marriage. He argued that since he was now legally free, and I was not bound by any ties, we could live a happy life together without the constraints of society. I was torn by his proposal, for as much as I loved him, I could not agree to it. I could not bear the thought of living with him in sin, and I knew that our union could not be blessed by God if we did not follow the laws of the church. I told him as much, and he understood my reasons, though he was disappointed. We continued to live together as before, but it was not the same. I could feel the strain between us, and I knew that our happiness was not complete. I longed to be his true wife, to stand by his side and share his name, but it seemed an impossible dream. One day, as I was sitting in the garden, lost in thought, I heard a voice calling my name. It was Mr. Rochester, and he was walking towards me, supported by a man I did not recognize. As he drew closer, I could see that he had been injured, his face horribly disfigured by the flames. He told me that the night before, his bed had caught fire, and he had been badly burned while trying to put it out. The man with him was his brother-in-law, who had come to take him away to a place where he could be cared for. He asked me to go with him, to be his nurse and his companion. I agreed, and we left Thornfield, our home, behind. It was a painful separation, for we did not know if we would ever return. Yet, as we journeyed together, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I knew that whatever the future held, I would face it with Mr. Rochester by my side. Chapter 33. The New Mrs. Rochester. The night before Jane's wedding, she had a strange dream in which she heard the laughter of Mr. Rochester's first wife, Bertha Mason. It filled her with dread, and she awoke with a start. She dismissed it as just a bad dream, but the memory stayed with her as she prepared for her wedding. The next day, she arrived at the church, eager to be married to the man she loved. As she stood at the altar, waiting for Mr. Rochester to appear, she noticed a stranger in the back of the church. It was a woman, dressed in a veil and cloak, hiding her face. Jane's heart raced with fear and uncertainty. As the ceremony began, Mr. Rochester arrived, but something was different about him. He seemed changed, and Jane couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. They exchanged their vows, and as they left the church, the strange woman followed them. Later that night, Jane discovered the truth about the mysterious woman. She was none other than Bertha Mason's brother, Richard. He had come to England to find his sister and had tracked her to Mr. Rochester's house. Richard revealed that Bertha had died in the fire that destroyed Thornfield Hall, and that Mr. Rochester was now a widower. Jane was shocked and devastated by the news. She had never imagined that Mr. Rochester had been hiding such a secret from her. However, she knew that her love for him was true, and she made the decision to stay by his side and care for him, despite his condition. In the days that followed, Jane became the new Mrs. Rochester, taking on the role of a nurse to her beloved husband. She discovered that he had lost his sight and one of his hands in the fire, and she remained devoted to him despite his disability. Though their life together was far from perfect, Jane and Mr. Rochester found happiness in their love for one another. Together, they faced the challenges of their past and present, building a life together that was filled with love and companionship. Chapter 34. The Interview. Jane had reunited with her cousins and discovered that they were her distant relations. St. John, a missionary, attempted to convince Jane to accompany him to India as his wife, but Jane refused. She would not marry him without love, and she could not deny the love she had for Mr. Rochester. Despite her refusal, St. John persisted and tried to guilt Jane into changing her mind by appealing to her sense of duty and claiming that it was God's will for her to go to India. However, Jane remained steadfast in her decision, even when St. John revealed that her uncle, John Eyre, had died and left her a fortune of £20,000. The interview showcased Jane's strong will and her unwavering belief in the importance of love and self-respect. also highlights the societal expectations of women during that time period and the struggles that women faced in asserting their independence and autonomy. Throughout the conversation, Jane displayed a deep understanding of her own values and remained true to herself, despite St. John's attempts to sway her. She refused to be manipulated into making a decision that did not align with her heart, even when tempted with financial security and the promise of a respectable life as a missionary's wife. As the conversation came to an end, Jane realized that she would never be happy without the man she loved, and she made the decision to return to Mr. Rochester. She understood that marrying for love was more important than wealth or societal expectations, and she had the courage to stand up for herself and make her own decisions. Chapter 35. The Poacher. I had left Thornfield Hall, now in ruins, and had wandered for days in a desolate state. Finally, I came upon a kind family who took me in, and I worked for them for a time. One day, as I was wandering in the countryside, I came upon a man who had been shot. I took him back to the house, and with the help of the kind family, we managed to save his life. The man turned out to be St. John Rivers, my cousin. St. John and I had never met before, but we quickly grew to like each other. I learned that he was a clergyman, and that he was planning to go on a mission trip to India. He asked me to go with him as his wife, but I could not accept, as my heart still belonged to Mr. Rochester. One day, St. John and I went for a walk, and we came upon a man who had been poaching on St. John's land. St. John was furious and wanted to turn the man into the authorities, but I persuaded him to let the man go, as I felt sorry for him. St. John reluctantly agreed, and we left the man to continue his poaching. As we walked, St. John told me of his plans to become a missionary in India, and how he wanted me to go with him as his wife. He said that we would be doing God's work, and that it was our duty to help the poor and needy. But I could not bring myself to accept, as my heart still belonged to Mr. Rochester. I told St. John of my feelings for Mr. Rochester, and he was disappointed, but he understood. He wished me well, and we parted ways. I continued to wonder, but I knew that I had to find Mr. Rochester, and to see if we could be together again. Chapter 36. The New Servant. I had been living at Ferndean for several months, and though I was happy there, I longed to see new faces and to have more people around me. So, when Mr. Rochester decided to engage a new servant, I was excited to meet her. Her name was Sophie, and she was a French woman with a gentle disposition and a sweet voice. I immediately took a liking to her, and we became friends. Sophie soon became indispensable to us. She was an excellent cook, a skillful seamstress, and a great help in the garden. Mr. Rochester was pleased with her, and he often praised her work. But there was something mysterious about Sophie, something that piqued my curiosity. I noticed that she was often lost in thought, and that she seemed to be carrying a burden. One day, I asked her about it. At first, Sophie was reluctant to talk. But then she confided in me that she had a son who had been taken away from her when he was a baby. She had never seen him since, and she didn't know if he was alive or dead. I was deeply moved by Sophie's story, and I promised to help her find her son. Mr. Rochester was also touched by her plight, and he offered to use his connections to assist us in our search. So, we set out on a mission to find Sophie's lost child. We traveled to France, and with Mr. Rochester's help, we were able to track down Sophie's son, who was now a grown man. When we finally found him, Sophie was overjoyed, and the two were reunited at last. It was a touching moment, and I was grateful to have been a part of it. As I watched Sophie and her son embrace, I realized that there was a lot of pain and suffering in the world. But there was also love and compassion, and it was up to each of us to choose which path we would follow. In the end, Sophie's story taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of family and the power of hope. And I was grateful for the opportunity to help her find happiness once again. Chapter 37. The Reconciliation. The days of misery and heartbreak have come to an end as I am finally reunited with my beloved Rochester. After my flight from Thornfield Hall, I thought I would never see him again. But fate has been kind to us and brought us back together. As we sit by the fireside, Rochester reveals the truth behind the fire that destroyed his home and blinded him. It was Bertha, his wife, who was the source of the disaster. I cannot help but feel a sense of pity for her. She was the cause of much pain and suffering, but at the same time, she was also a victim of circumstance. Rochester's honesty and sincerity move me to tears. He confesses his love for me and asks me to be his wife once again. How could I refuse him? My heart has always belonged to him. We are both older and wiser now. The mistakes of our past have taught us valuable lessons. We have come to realize the importance of forgiveness, both for ourselves and for those who have wronged us. As we embrace and pledge our love to one another, I know that our future will not be without its challenges. But I am comforted by the knowledge that we will face them together with love, honesty, and trust. Looking back on our tumultuous journey, I am grateful for the lessons it has taught me. I have learned the true meaning of love, forgiveness, and the resilience of the human spirit. And I am humbled by the knowledge that, even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a brighter future. As I rest my head on Rochester's shoulder and feel his arms wrap around me, I know that I have found my true home. And I am filled with a sense of peace and Chapter 38. The Happy Ending. Jane Eyre has finally found the happiness that has eluded her for so long. She is now married to the man she loves, Mr. Rochester, and has become a mother to their son. Their home is now filled with love and joy, and Jane is content in her new role as wife and mother. Mr. Rochester has been given a second chance at life, thanks to Jane's love and care. He is no longer the embittered and cynical man he once was, but rather a happy and contented husband and father. Jane's love has healed his physical and emotional wounds, and he is grateful for her every day. Their life together is simple and peaceful, and they spend their days enjoying each other's company and the company of their child. Jane is no longer the lonely and impoverished governess she once was, but a beloved wife and mother in a home filled with warmth and happiness. As they sit by the fire one evening, Mr. Rochester reflects on how lucky he is to have Jane by his side. He tells her that he can't imagine life without her and that he is grateful for every moment they have together. Jane feels the same way, and they hold each other close, content in their love. As the years pass, their love only grows stronger. Their son grows into a fine young man, and they continue to cherish every moment they spend together. Though they have had their share of struggles and hardships, they have overcome them all with love and determination. In the end, Jane Eyre has found the happiness and contentment she has always sought. She has become the mistress of her own fate, and her love for Mr. Rochester has brought her the peace and joy she deserves. As they sit together in their happy home, surrounded by the love they have built together, Jane knows that she has found her true calling in life to. Thank you for listening to Miniature Masterpiece. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more awesome content.